You're listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. To guide us through the intricacies and intersections of emotions, relationships, and male identity is renowned psychologist, author, and speaker Gunter. This is Inspire Change.
Before I begin the actual podcast, I would like to respectfully acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, who are the traditional custodians of the land on which I work. I would also like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Welcome everybody to another episode of Inspire Change with Gunter. I'm your host. Going to walk you through a whole bunch of interesting topics on masculinity in this new series that I've planned out, and to see us through to the end of the year and then the beginning of the next season. Yes, this is going to be season 6 in 2024. I'm really excited about that, and I hope you will continue to join me as we explore areas of psychology, anthropology, sociology, psychopathology, all sorts of stuff. But my main focus is on making good men great. Let's focus not just on emotional resilience, but also on character building, because that's ultimately where this all needs to go. Alright, so what are we going to be talking about today? Well, I want to introduce the topic of busting a few myths in masculinities, but in order to do that, and to lead into the other areas of our discussion, I want to focus a bit on the history of patriarchy, that thing that has hung across our necks like an albatross, that's really been not just toxic to the individual, but to society as a whole. And again, let me reiterate here that it is not masculinity that is toxic. It is patriarchy. It's an ideology. So I want to really set out on this journey through time to understand the roots and the evolution of patriarchy. It's a complex topic, and I've written about it, I've talked about it, and I will continue to write and talk about it because we need to get more traction on the topic. It's often seen as a contentious topic, but it's fundamentally crucial for understanding many of the aspects of our current social dynamics and the stuff that plagues us to our core. So let's begin with defining what patriarchy is. So patriarchy is a social system where men hold primary power and predominate in political leadership, moral authority, and property and control, economics. But it's also a system where traditionally men hold power in the family. But the question is, how and why did such a system or systems emerge? So let's go back a little bit. Let's time travel. I think what's important to remember is that patriarchy as a social system wasn't always the norm. In fact, many early societies were more egalitarian. If we look at hunter-gatherers, for example, we see a much more egalitarian social distribution between the genders. Unfortunately, the Big Bang occurred when agriculture was developed and societies became more settled. We started to begin to live in bigger groups, and property and inheritance became really important. So think about it. If you're a hunter-gatherer, you're going to be walking from place to place, essentially following food. There's a beautiful little sort of documentary video on YouTube where a white guy asks this bushman, hunter-gatherer, about what the purpose in life is. And it was really interesting because he pondered this for a while, almost as if he'd never thought about the idea of what is the purpose of life. And beside him was a younger man, and the two of them looked at each other and they sort of, considered it. And then the older man says, meat. Now, it's a very simplistic and simple response. And although on the surface appears simplistic, it isn't. Because in their world, that is what matters most, in many respects, as well as keeping the family unit together. So, if we come back to what did agriculture do, then the answer is that it laid the groundwork for patriarchal structures, where controlling property, and therefore by extension women and children, became a central tenet. And you go, okay, well, what is the problem with that? Well, we're going to address that in later stages. But right now, let me continue with my time travel. So we've come out of the hunter-gatherer society. We're now into the agricultural revolution and all that it entails, one of which is that we begin to live in cities. Now, the best example of that really is ancient Egypt, Greece, Rome, the Assyrians, the Middle East, and most of these cultures became entrenched in patriarchy. Patriarchy was institutionalized and, incorporated in law. So men were seen as the head of the family and the state as well. Women's roles were largely confined to the domestic sphere, and it became fundamentally almost a legal thing. As a woman, especially in Greece and in Rome, you really didn't have a public life on your own. You were an extension of your pater, your father. And he would make all the decisions for you. So, even though women learnt how to work within the system to get some independence and autonomy and agency, the law fundamentally put men in charge, always. Now, what happens as we go along is we see that this becomes more and more entrenched. So now we're going into the Middle Ages, and now patriarchy especially becomes intertwined in the Christian religion. The Christian church, for example, played a significant role in perpetuating patriarchal values. Men were fundamentally seen as the representatives of God on earth, further entrenching their authority in both family and society. So this all works really, really well for the guys, but obviously it's got some downsides for women. And so there's always, throughout history, been some tension there. This tension has articulated itself not just, politically and economically, but also in sciences. So if we now come into the contemporary times, and we're looking at the current challenges, what's happening? I've got a special announcement about how you can work with me. Since starting this podcast, I've had a lot of inquiries from listeners asking how they can work with me on a one-to-one basis. Now, I finally managed to free up some time to work with about 5 clients privately. Typically, we'll work together for 6 months, applying the ideas I discuss here to help you lead a fulfilled, meaningful, and happy life, and a well-rounded life. If that's something you'd be interested in, drop me an email at gunter@goodmengreat.com and we'll be in touch. Well, one of the main things is that patriarchy is being actively challenged. Not all men are happy with this. Movements like feminism and gender equality initiatives are questioning and dismantling the traditional power structures. The conversation is now about inclusivity, recognizing the harm that patriarchal systems have inflicted, not just on women, but also on men, mainly through enforcing restrictive gender roles. And again, in another podcast, I'm going to get more and more into that. All right? So, historically, where we're currently at? Well, we've gone from a more egalitarian society amongst the hunter-gatherers to the patriarchal system through the advent of the agricultural revolution. And let me again point out that if it comes to quality of life, I think that in many, many respects, hunter-gatherers had it all over agriculturalists. Agricultural lifestyles are hard. We can see that with the farmers. Even today, it's difficult, even with all the technology that we've got available. It is not an easy thing. The anthropologists, at least some of them, argue that hunter-gatherers at most would work about 17 hours a week. And yes, there was ongoing foraging and gathering, and some of that was shared with women, and some of it the women did themselves, and a lot of women did the sort of basket weaving and some of those things as well, whereas the men maintained their weapons and so on. So there was some, division of labour, but essentially it was a lot more egalitarian. Agricultural revolution brought about a deep gender division. And so, a couple of examples. It has such an impact that, for example, archaeologists in the 19th century would interpret things through a patriarchal lens. So whenever they found a grave, for example, with a skeleton and weapons, the instant assumption was that this was a male. It was a male warrior. Well, in more modern times, one of the things that's come about is that we've seen that that's not necessarily the case at all. That in a lot of instances, women were also warriors. But before we get carried away and go, okay, Germanic and Viking burials showed that there was gender equity in their society, we might be stretching the bow a little bit here, because although women did have an easier time of it to gain power and economic position, there was still a strong patriarchal streak amongst Vikings and the Germanic tribes. How that exactly articulated, we don't really know, because there's not necessarily a lot of written material from those cultures. So where to from here? Well, that's a really good question. One of the things that I want to build up over the next few episodes of this podcast is to demonstrate how an ideology like patriarchy can perpetuate myths that very quickly entrench themselves in religious thought, in philosophical thought, and in scientific thinking. Stuff that, we sort of are questioning now were once seen to be scientific fact, like the fact that men are ordained, in a sense, by God to be in charge of everything, that men's lack of emotional vocabulary, for example, was innate. It had nothing to do with socialisation, and it didn't have anything to do with how we brought up. So, stuff like that, I think, really needs to be stuff to be critically examined and thought through before we come to, very simplistic conclusions like men are better at reading maps than women, which has been disproven time and time again, or that men are from Mars and women are from Venus, and this is why that we are the way we are. It's just that we're different species. And it's complete rubbish, really. So the couple of topics that I want to get into over the next few podcasts is I want to talk about the issue about emotional functioning and the idea of vulnerability, which in patriarchal thinking is always a good topic to get people stirred up on. The other area that I want to sort of discuss is that of physical strength and aggression. and moving then into examining how we could imagine gender roles to be if we didn't have patriarchy. Because, in many respects, those of us who are in the conservative camp need to remember that we can never ever go back to how things were, nor that we should. All right? I know the 1950s for some people look very, very appealing, but in many realities they weren't that appealing. As long as you didn't buck the social order, you were okay. But, I was about to say God forbid. Interesting. But, if we are going to really, really move forward as a civilization from which we can talk about being civilized, we can't continue to harken back to something that was, even when it's dressed up nicely. Our history, for many, many people, isn't that good. And now, I'm not just talking about women and children. I'm also talking about those who were not of a particular culture, dominant culture. Colonialism left behind bloodshed, tears, despair, as it ravaged through cultures that were different, that were assumed to be primitive. Now, I live in a country where that's been particularly evident in recent history. The last 220 years, 230 years has decimated a culture that lived undisturbed for 65,000 years. Now, you'd think, if you thought about this a bit more critically, that anyone who's been around for that long has got some idea about how to live in and with an environment. But no, Western Judeo-Christian culture dismissed all of it as primitive, simply because the technology wasn't comparable to what Western civilization had. And again, we're committing this in the future. I mean, one of the things I want to plant as a seed is that if we allow ourselves to purely focus on technology as a savior of the human race in its struggle with climate change, with geopolitical forces, then we're going to lose. Technology isn't the thing that's going to save us. What is going to get us together and hold together is through an equitable moral system, through ethics, philosophy, the arts, tolerance. Those sorts of things are the things that are going to help us evolve. Technology is a tool that comes along with it. And yes, there's some wonderful breakthroughs, don't get me wrong. I'm an early adopter and adapter to technology from way back. Love it in a way. But, to allow it to take over as the driver is a bit like allowing economics to take over social policy, which I've spoken about before and I see as a bad thing. We can't allow it to do it on its own. It needs to have regulators. Regulators would be things like psychology, sociology, philosophy. What is it that we know about being human? And therefore we also need the neurosciences there to help us understand ourselves and our nature better, to understand the social overlays. So hopefully this is going to stimulate some discussion. It's going to bring you to a point where you are going to begin to think critically about many things that you may have simply accepted as given. And those of you who are Jordan Peterson fans, no, lobsters are not going to help. Serotonin isn't purely responsible for living hierarchically. In fact, that's the responsibility of agriculture and amassing wealth, materialism. So the few began to control the many. Now, the question is, Is that going to take us into the millennia, or are we going to allow ourselves to become extinct because of it? So on that note, please join me for the next exciting podcast. And for those of you who have subscribed, look forward to having you join me. And for those of you who are new, I'm hoping that you're going to come on board and see this as a platform for some stimulating thought and growth and change. So until next time, this is me signing off.
Love to hear from you. And if you're interested, please check out my work on www.guntersvoboda.com or www.goodmengreat.com.
Thank you for listening to Inspire Change, a broadcast that strives to educate, motivate, and empower men to challenge traditions of masculinity. For more information on the Making Good Men Great movement, or for individual or group coaching sessions with Gunter, visit goodmengreat.com. For inquiries regarding broadcast topics or appearing on the show, email Miranda at noirtainment.com. That's Miranda at noirtainment.com.